Well, good morning to you. I'm Stephanie Fraschetti, and you're tuned to 91.5 Kingdom FM's Praise in the Morning. However, a very special morning. Today, we are privileged to have in studio with us a special guest. I've got our president and CEO, Art Ramos, in the house with me, as well as Joel C. Rosenberg, New York Times bestselling author of 7 novels, 5 nonfiction books, including The Last Jihad, Copper Scroll, Epicenter, and his latest, Damascus Countdown, with nearly 3 million copies sold. As a communications advisor, Joel's worked closely with Steve Forbes, Rush Limbaugh, Benjamin Netanyahu, many Israeli and U.S. leaders. He's addressed audiences all over the world, and he is here in the studio with us today. And there has been much acclaim about his work ever since The Last Jihad. This is a novel that he was working on during September 11th, actually completed the writing of The Last Jihad the week prior to our attacks on September 11th. And when they happened, the book had not yet been published. However, everything has changed. Joel, welcome to the studios. Thank you so much for being with us today. And tell us about the coincidence of the events, the writing of this book, September 11th, and basically the biblical prophecy that we're experiencing right now.
We got a deal fairly quickly, and by November of 2002, The Last Jihad was released. Now, no one had ever heard of me or the book, but it became #1 on Amazon, 11 weeks on the New York Times list. And I got interviewed on 160 radio and TV shows in about a 60-day window.
None as cool as this radio morning show, obviously.
But
yeah.
Most of them were secular stations because nobody knew I was a believer.
Sure.
And what was interesting about it was, I remember one guy in my hometown. I was on a show with a guy named Brother Wheeze. It was from a rock station, and I don't know how they put me on this, but at first there weren't that many people who wanted to talk, and then it expanded. Yeah. But he was like, "Dude, your name's Rosenberg, right?" I said, "Right." "Well, that's a Hebrew name, right? You're Jewish, right?" I said, "On my father's side, yes. My mom's a Gentile." He goes, "But in your book, you got all these people, they're talking about Jesus at the end." I said, "Right." He said, "What are you, a born again, an evangelical?" It's like some sort of space alien thing. I said, "Well, I do believe Jesus is the Messiah." And it doesn't dominate the book, but there's a spiritual element to the novel.
Sure.
He goes, "I don't understand how that can be. How can you be Jewish and believe in Jesus?" And I said, "Well, Mr. Wheeze,
brother.
Yeah, brother. I don't think he was quite a brother yet, but that was his handle." I said, "I don't think it's a fascinating story. Actually, I don't think you have time for me to go through it right now." He goes, "Oh, no, listen. To have a guy on my show that writes fiction that comes true, that's one thing that's weird. But to have a Jew who believes in Jesus, now that I gotta hear, son. I'm keeping you over the break. We're gonna go through this. You just could walk me through it, son." And that began an opportunity to talk about my faith as well as events in the world with about 20 million people in a 60-day window. And suddenly I'd gone from, failed political consultant, which is really my background. Everyone I ever worked for either lost, retired, or, just gave up entirely. And so, except for Netanyahu.
Yeah, right.
I was on his comeback campaign team in the year 2000.
Cool.
You might note it took him 9 years to come back, and I wasn't with my help.
Rosenberg's coming, lock the doors.
So just to be clear, I don't want to overstate my political credentials.
Hey, everything
now I'm
prepares
writing
us.
Fiction,
right.
writing fiction for a living. Yeah.
And Joel, it's amazing how media sets you up, huh?
It really did, because it opened a door. People were fascinated. How could you know this, Joel? I said, I didn't know. I was projecting what could happen. And that's all the novels since are about worst case scenarios geopolitically. What if that happened? But I also weave in Bible prophecies. And so, because I like to, because we know we as followers of Christ know that the Bible is true. We know that these prophecies about the end times will come to pass. But we don't know exactly when, and we don't know exactly how. Well, that's perfect for a novelist to say, okay, well, these are hugely dramatic events, high-stakes events that are going to change the world. What if they did happen in our lifetime? What would that look like? We don't know, but we can imagine. We can do a war game. So for the new book, for example, Damascus Countdown, kind of do the bookends, Last Jihad and now Damascus. The Damascus Countdown is about what if an American president miscalculates with regards to Iran's nuclear weapons program. In other words, what if he tries to use diplomacy, economic sanctions, covert operations to slow down or hopefully even stop Iran from getting the bomb? That's great. We'd prefer that to war, but what if it doesn't work? What if Iran acquires not just one nuclear warhead, but 9? That's the premise of this series. Damascus Countdown is the third and final in a series that begins with a book called The 12th Imam. Mm-hmm. That's the name of the so-called Messiah of the Shia Muslims. Then the Tehran Initiative and Damascus Countdown. And so as this novel series comes to a conclusion, it's, okay, the president has miscalculated. Iran has an arsenal. Israel feels like it's ready to launch a preemptive military strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, and the American president's still pressuring Israel, don't do it. We can contain Iran, but what if Israel launches anyway? What would that look like? What would the effect of an Israeli attack be, potentially? And what would the blowback be? How would Iran retaliate? And might they draw Syria into that fight of firing thousands, maybe tens of thousands of missiles back at Israel to annihilate Israel? And then one more what if woven into that scenario, which is, of course, fairly realistic given where we are right now. Sure. What if the prophecies from Isaiah 17 and Jeremiah 49 come true? These are the prophecies about the destruction, the utter, complete destruction of Damascus as a sovereign city. These are prophecies that go back 2,000 years or so, maybe let's say 2,500 years at least. In Isaiah, that's 2,700 years ago. And Damascus has never been destroyed the way Isaiah and Jeremiah said it would. It's been conquered, it's been attacked, it's changed hands. But it's never been utterly, completely destroyed. In fact, Damascus is considered one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on the planet. So that means this is an end times prophecy, which means Damascus will be utterly laid waste. Mm-hmm. We don't know how. The texts tell us the bottom line. It doesn't give us
the how
detail. And so Damascus Countdown says, what if a conflict between Israel, Syria, and Iran had not just catastrophic geopolitical and economic consequences, but what if it set into motion the fulfillment of major end times Bible prophecies? And I'm encouraged by the fact that for 4 weeks, Damascus Countdown has been on the New York Times bestseller list. I think it shows a lot of interest both in the region, but also in the curiosity about, maybe what does the Bible say about the future of certain countries?
Why are we in this current state of affairs? I was just checking out your website, and for those of you that want to know more about Joel, it's joelrosenberg.com.
Yes.
joelrosenberg.com. You can check out more there. And you, on your blog, you had recently addressed North Korea and the events that are going on there, the nuclear threats, and I've been watching it every day. And and basically they're saying the time it's imminent. The strike is imminent. What can we do? Should we do something about that? Is it a real threat?
It's a huge threat. North Korea already has nuclear warheads. Mm-hmm. We don't think that they have ballistic missiles that can reach the continental United States, though their maps showed hitting Los Angeles and Austin, Texas. And I had the opportunity to sit in the last 10 days with 2 former Central Intelligence Agency directors and spend significant hours with them trying to understand their perspective. They don't think we can be hit directly by a long-range ballistic missile.
Continental.
What about intercontinental? But they believe that short-range missiles, that North Korea not only has them, and even intermediate range, almost that could reach Guam, and they do have operational nuclear warheads. This is enormously dangerous. Interestingly, in 2008, I wrote a novel called Dead Heat. In Dead Heat, North Korea launches a preemptive nuclear strike against 4 American cities. Austin, Texas was not one of them, but it was Los Angeles, Seattle, New York, and Washington. And they launched those not from intercontinental ballistic missiles, but from container ships with short-range missiles that there's commercial container ships that suddenly they open one up, have a short-range launcher, and fire as though a sub-launch, just with minutes to spare. That was a horrifying scenario to write about in 2008. It was supposed to be fiction. Now North Korea is threatening something very similar to this. And one high-ranking former CIA official told me that from the moment the leader in Pyongyang were to make that decision, if he does, God forbid, to launch a nuclear weapon against Seoul, South Korea, the capital of South Korea, the decision to the obliteration of the city of Seoul is about a 57-second interval.
Wow. So not much can be done.
No.
Unless it's preemptive.
I mean, you could preemptively launch an attack against North Korea. I don't see our president, making a decision like that. What's interesting, Stephanie, is and Art, is that now put this back into the Iran context for a moment. Because one of the things President Bush, I think, has been shown to be prescient on who are the most evil countries on the planet. But the thing is, one of the things that the Israelis are saying about Iran is, Mr. President, please show a credible military option that you're considering strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. Maybe that will convince Iran to give up its weapons program. In my novel, Iran and North Korea are working very closely on the bomb. Now we're seeing even more evidence that that's true. What's disturbing from my perspective is that President Obama, on his recent trip to Israel, which I'm glad he took, said that, yes, all options are on the table with regards to Iran. But at the same time, he was pulling a carrier strike group out of the Persian Gulf region. And now he's saying that he might pull the other one out because of budget reasons, right? He's blaming the Republicans for this. Now, setting aside politics, you could say, well, do we really not have money to have carrier battle groups around Iran? Because you're sending a message of not having a credible military option if you're pulling military options out of the region. But then we turned out to be putting carrier battle groups, missile frigates, B-52s, stealth bombers in and around South Korea, which tells us we do have the money to do it. And the president does know how to send a message to a foreign government. Don't mess with Texas, as it were. Don't mess with the United States. Don't mess with our allies. Now, the president's doing the right thing so far in South Korea with the North Korean threat. But the Iranians are watching this situation, and they're saying, well, he's not doing that with us.
Why?
So maybe he's not that serious with us, which is leaving it to Israel. Israel's going to have to make a decision. Okay, the president came. We did some nice photo ops. It was all wonderful. But the president's not serious about neutralizing the Iran nuclear threat.
Sure.
And that's exactly the scenario that happens in my novel series, which leads Israel to decide we have to go it alone. And look, I'm praying for peace, but I think we have to prepare for the possibility that in 2013 or early next year, Israel might need to make that decision, and we could have a full-blown catastrophic war on our hands in the Middle East.
And the commercials with Netanyahu, that were aired in the United States saying, how long do we have to wait? Why, what are we waiting for? How bad does it have to be? Why do we have to wait? Why do you think that's going on? Because it is obviously such a highly volatile area.
Yes.
Why are we treating it as though it's just a scrape?
Well, if you go back to the 2008 Democratic primaries, then Senator Barack Obama said in one of his meetings that publicly that Iran was not a large country and it wasn't a significant threat. Now, the next day he changed it with a prepared text and he said, yes, it's a serious threat. We need to deal with it. But one wonders how seriously the president really takes it. I mean, he's given time to it. But one of the things he's done positively, I mean, let's make sure we're balanced. The president has shown us that 4 years of effort to use diplomacy hasn't worked. Now, I think some of us would have concluded based on the nature of the Iranian regime that negotiations wouldn't work. But it is useful to know it for sure, right? You don't want to launch a war if you don't have to, if there's any way to convince the Iranian leadership not to do it. But I think the president doesn't take the threat seriously enough. And he has I think, a blind spot when it comes to the areas of radical Islam. He's very convinced that because he lives in a Muslim country, Indonesia, and has some Muslim family. I'm not saying that's about himself,
Sure.
but I think he believes that given his background and his history and experience, that he maybe understands Islam better than most.
Mm-hmm.
Well, better than most, perhaps, but I don't think he understands this current regime in Iran.
Yeah.
They are not just Muslims, they're Shia Muslims, and they're not just Shia Muslims, they're radical Muslims, and they're not just radical, they're part of a cult in Iran known as Twelvers. Very quickly, there's 3 elements you need to know about Twelvers. They believe the end of the world is at hand. They believe that their Messiah, which they call the 12th Imam, thus the Twelver, they believe he's coming to reign over the entire globe at any moment. And third, they believe that the way to hasten or accelerate the coming of the 12th Imam is to annihilate 2 countries, Israel, which they call the Little Satan, and the United States, which they call the Great Satan. So Israel's a problem. That's why the Iranian leadership talked about wiping Israel off the map. But that's not their ultimate goal. Israel's an irritant to them, but the United States is the Great Satan. We represent Christendom to them, and also corruption, which sadly we all know is sort of the mix that we've got.
Sure.
People claiming to be Christians, and yet a culture debauched with pornography and abortion, 54 million abortions, and now gay marriage, and the whole violent crime, adultery, heterosexual adultery, divorce, abuse of children. And we've got this horrible combination, and the Iranian leaders say that country's going down, just as the Soviets went down.
Also a formidable foe militarily. I mean, we actually are probably, obviously the superpower that could maybe come against them. So even in increasing the hate. If you've just joined us, we're talking with Joel C. Rosenberg. He's the New York Times best-selling author of 7 novels, 5 nonfiction books, including The Last Jihad. We spoke about that, The Copper Scroll, Epicenter, and his latest, Damascus Countdown, spending the 4th week on the New York Times bestseller list. Joel's worked with a number of U.S. and Israeli leaders, including Steve Forbes and Benjamin Netanyahu. He's addressed audiences all over the world. He's here with us this morning. He is actually speaking in Naples at First Baptist Church of Naples this weekend, Saturday evening at 6 p.m. and also Sunday, 2 services, 9:30 a.m. and 11 a.m. You can find out more about that at fbcn.org, First Baptist Church Naples, fbcn.org. Find out more about Joel at joelrosenberg.com. So much more to talk about. This is really, really got our attention because this isn't something that we're just reading about. This generation is actually living the end times. And you're talking about these prophecies, and anybody that's not familiar, once hearing, would have to stand up and take notice.
Well, and this is what I'm going to be teaching about at First Baptist Naples. I'm going to really look at a specific set of prophecies regarding Syria, both to look at what the future of Syria and Damascus is according to the Scriptures, but also to show how to study Bible prophecy, why it's important, put it in the larger context of end times prophecies. Now, I know there are many skeptics and cynics about prophecy, and it's often been taught badly. It's taught and spoken about at times as though people are, talking about aliens or something weird, and so that can be undermining and it can be discrediting. But 1 out of 4 verses in the Bible are prophecies. Of the 1,000 or so prophecies that are in the Bible, more than half have already come true. And most of the rest, not all, but most of the rest of the prophecies will be fulfilled from between today and the second coming of Christ. There are some additional prophecies about the 1,000-year reign of Christ, about the new heaven, the new earth, but most of the prophecies that remain are today up to the second coming. Now, there are skeptics and cynics, and even Christians who, they're believers and they're born again. That's great, but they're not like, I don't know about prophecy. That seems a little weird, a little beyond my comfort zone. But keep this in mind. The Bible said that Israel would be reborn as a country in the last days of history. This is Ezekiel 36 and 37. that Jews would come back to the Holy Land after centuries of exile from all over the planet, that the Jews would be able to rebuild the ancient ruins, make the deserts bloom. A whole series of prophecies. All of those have come true in our lifetime. Israel's now 65 or so years old. That's extraordinary. Most of us, when we hear Israel in the news, the president going to Israel,
Been there forever.
yeah, we just think, well, of course. But for 2,000 years, most people on the planet didn't believe the Bible, didn't believe that Israel would be reborn, and even our church fathers, most of them did not believe the Bible was literally true in this area of Israel literally becoming a country and the Jews literally coming back to the Holy Land. They thought, well, that's metaphoric. That must be the church. It can't. So for 2,000 years, people, including most church leaders, didn't think the Bible was true about Israel, and now it's come to pass. And I think it raises the question we'll talk about more on Sunday, Saturday night and Sunday at First Baptist Naples. If some of these Bible prophecies about the end times have already come to pass, isn't it remotely possible that some of the others will come true also? And when you look at a world filled with wars, rumors of wars, persecution of the Christians, apostasy, lawlessness, natural disasters, you start and trouble in the very countries the Bible says will be where we're looking in the last days, you do have to start to wonder, maybe the return of Christ is closer than we had thought.
Sure. I mean, we're talking about earthquakes of mammoth proportion. We're talking about hurricanes hitting New York, New Jersey. Devastation that we've never seen in places that are just so unlikely.
And these natural disasters often come with headlines that say they're historic, that they were larger than ever. Sure. They're hitting places that never seemed to be hit before. These are not normal developments. They're all the things that Jesus talked about in Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13. He actually gives a list. The disciples ask, could you just give us one sign that would be give us a sense that when you're getting close to returning? And Jesus could have given a sort of Don Rumsfeld, Washington political answer. No comment. Next question. But he doesn't. He gives a very detailed list. And when you look at the list, you start to go, wars? Check. Rumors of wars? Check. Persecution of Christians all over the world? Check. Natural disasters? Check. Lawlessness? Check. People betraying one another in record numbers? Check. People's love for one another growing cold? Check. The gospel being preached all over the world, including through radio, including through television, including through the internet to reach every person? Check, 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 check. The rebirth of Israel? Check. And you start to think, my goodness, this list is getting checked off. And Jesus said in Matthew 24, when you see all these things happening, know that I'm near, that my hand is right on the door. Now, I'm not Harold Camping. I don't know when Jesus is coming back. You remember the guy that said a couple of years ago, May 21st, 6 o'clock. May 21st came, nothing. And then he said, I meant October. And then October came. You know, I've got one of his books on my shelf back home. He wrote the book 1994. 500-page book on why 1994 was going to be the year of the rapture. Didn't happen. Look, Jesus said no one knows the day or hour. So we're not supposed to speculate on that precision. But he did give us a list of things to say, when you see these things happening, you need to be ready, because I'm coming at a moment you don't expect, but you'll have a general sense that I'm inbound when you see these things. We were talking off air when I got here, Stephanie, you were asking about my kids. So we've got 4 boys, 18, 16, 14, and 8.
Share the names, Joel.
Caleb, Jacob, Jonah, and Noah. Now, some people say, now, wait a minute, there's a gap there between Jonah and Noah, 14 and then 8.
Hello.
Why did you have a Noah? And I say, because in Matthew 24, Jesus says he's not coming back again until the days of Noah. So we thought, if we're holding him back,
let's help this.
We'd better have a Noah.
Along, right?
So if your listeners don't remember anything about this conversation, which is possible, just remember we're living in the days of Noah.
And the Rosenbergs helped to facilitate that.
Well,
Thank you, Joel, because we want to see Jesus.
And Jesus' point there is, Noah was told by God that something significant and supernatural was coming, that judgment was coming, that he and his family would be rescued, and that they should be ready. That's all they knew.
Right.
And so they did what they were told to do. And what the Lord Jesus was saying was, I'm telling you that something supernatural is coming. I'm going to rescue those who follow me, who listen to my word and obey. And there's judgment coming for those who don't. And I'm not going to tell you exactly when, but you need to be ready.
People
and in that same
ready.
Context, yeah. Now, yeah, because
Jesus is coming. Soon
exactly.
we'll be going home. Yeah.
I was speaking with Greg Laurie at a conference that he did. You know, I thought it was I thought pastors were sort of required, certainly Calvary pastors, to do prophecy conferences. But he'd never done one.
No.
But when he did one a few years ago, he invited me. And he made such an interesting point. Greg was talking to, 3,500 people at their congregation. And he said, he goes, I was saved in 1971, I think it was. And he said that when I got saved, I thought the rapture was imminent. I mean, I said to myself, maybe 1975 at the outset, but we'll be gone by then. And
that Left Behind, before the Left Behind series, we had all those 70s
Great
movies
Planet Earth
about
and all the rest.
Sure,
absolutely.
We're going the rapture.
Now, then he said, now how many people here came to faith in Jesus Christ in 1975 or later?
Right.
Well, I raised my hand. I was 1975, just to be clear. I'm only 45 now. And I would say the vast majority raised their hands. And he said, aren't you glad Jesus waited?
Yeah.
And I thought that was a great point that was really quite stunning, and put into context why the delay. There's so many events that have been happening since the rebirth of Israel that would seem to indicate Jesus is coming back, and he is. But he's patient. He wants every person to give their life to Jesus Christ, knowing that you can come to faith after the rapture if you're not dead. And so that's it's going to be the worst 7 years in all of human history. The first few months of the tribulation, the Bible says 1 out of 4 people on the planet will die. Some of those will be people who came to Christ after the rapture and realized that they'd heard the gospel on the radio or from a pastor or friends, but they never made a personal decision to receive Christ, and they'll realize, oh my gosh, I need to do that. But many will be people who just have rejected Christ, and how tragic that will be. So this is why Jesus told us to be ready. Not ready necessarily with a bomb shelter, not necessarily ready with, a year's supply of food. Ready spiritually to know that you're going to heaven, whether it's the end of the world or just the end of our personal lives. We're all in our last days.
Yeah.
We don't know how much more time we each individually have.
Yeah, be ready. You're tuned to 91.5 Kingdom FM. Praise in the morning. Typically, we would go from song to song, but we are so blessed today to have Joel C. Rosenberg, New York Times bestselling author, in the studio with us. A lot of you are familiar with many of his books, including The Last Jihad, the latest, Damascus Countdown, 4 weeks on the New York Times bestselling list. He is actually going to be this weekend the guest speaker at First Baptist Church Naples, Saturday night, 2 services Sunday morning. You can check that out. This has been just an amazingly informative time that we've spent together, Joel. We really appreciate you coming in here and sharing with us. I've got our president and CEO, Art Ramos, in the studio. Art, we were bantering about before Joel arrived here, and what are your thoughts?
Oh, my thoughts are that it's fascinating that what's happening in the world today, that we're definitely living in the last days. And as Joel mentioned, it's a checklist of things that have already happened. And we continue to see that every day in our lives. And if we focus our eyes on Jesus and keep our eyes on Israel and see what's happening, it's right there. It's right there in black and white. And the Lord wants us to keep our hearts pure, keep our minds pure, and keep looking for him. One question I do want to ask you, though, Joel, in prophetic word of the book of Joel, by the way.
One of my favorite book of the Bible.
Of course.
There you go. Somehow I knew
have
that.
to admit.
It talks about that they've divided up my land, Israel. And is that something that's still going to continue on? Or they still want to set up their Jerusalem as their capital, but then Iran's talking about annihilating Israel. So you got two different scenarios there.
You do. One of the things that's interesting is that the Bible does say that God is opposed to the dividing of his land. In fact, we did a conference. We do an annual conference called the Epicenter Conference. Sometimes we do them in the epicenter, Jerusalem, Israel. and sometimes we've had them in other parts of the country in the world, Philippines, Germany, so forth. But we did a conference last year, 2011, in Jerusalem called the Epicenter Conference, and we went through the book of Joel, verse by verse, line by line. Joel chapter 3, verse 2 says, this is God speaking, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, the valley of judgment, and then I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they, the nations, have scattered among the nations, and they have divided up my land. God is saying that he's going to judge all the nations that divide the land of Israel. Now, the problem is our nation is trying to divide the land of Israel, starting with President George W. Bush, who I have great respect for, but in an area that I disagreed with him strongly, he became the first American president to call for a Palestinian state, which would require dividing the land of Israel and creating a new sovereign entity there. President Obama has continued that up to and including a few weeks ago when he was in Israel. President Obama is calling for Jerusalem to be divided, the land of Israel to be divided. The state of Palestine, the way he wants it, is the West Bank and Gaza, but he wants them to be contiguous borders. For those of us who need to look that up, that's connected borders, meaning that the West Bank and Gaza will somehow be physically connected. Well, pull out a map. They're not connected, which means you're dividing Israel physically, that Israel would not be connected to itself. Its southern portion would be disconnected from the north. This is in direct contrast and in direct defiance of Joel chapter 3. And this is what's dangerous. We have enough troubles in our country with all the sins that we are struggling with now, plus $16 trillion of debt and all the other issues, to divide Israel in defiance of the prophecies, the scriptures, would be catastrophic for our country. And yet that's what we're pushing for. And I'm deeply concerned. And, of course, every country in the world is calling for this. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, listen, I'm for a demilitarized Palestinian state. But, you think about the fact that Gaza right now is controlled by a terrorist organization, Hamas, that has been firing thousands of missiles and rockets at innocent civilians in Israel. So is Israel supposed to be negotiating with them? Hamas they're not even unified with the leadership in the West Bank, what's known as the Palestinian Authority. So first of all, there's not peace between the Palestinians. Secondly, the Palestinian leadership in Mahmoud Abbas is currently serving the 8th year of his 4-year presidential term.
Nice. Isn't that interesting?
So they're not even being democratic. And the reason he doesn't want to hold elections is because he's afraid the terrorists will take over. Well, if he's afraid that the terrorists are going to take over, why should Israel give land at a moment that maybe tomorrow, after the paper is signed, terrorists take over? This is the fiction, I would say, as a fiction writer, of this process. Look, God loves the Palestinian people. He loves them. He cares for them. They should have the right to run their lives. But this is why I support what's called autonomy, not sovereignty. In other words, the Palestinians should not have a sovereign state that can make alliances with Iran and Syria and all these other terror groups and organizations. But they should be able to run their daily lives, their schools, their roads, their taxes, their water, communications. They should be able to run all of that on their own without Israeli interference. But that should be an autonomous sort of enclave within the state of Israel. And they can vote for their own leaders, that's fine. But otherwise, to create a sovereign state is to divide the land of Israel the way God says in Joel chapter 3 not to do.
Right. Then we see what's happening in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood. And when you hear Jay Sekulow talking about how our government has been given F-16s and money and tanks going to Egypt, and that's a neighbor of Israel. How, knowing Prime Minister Netanyahu, how he thinks, how do you think he feels about that, Joel?
Well, I don't want to characterize how he feels. It's a sensitive situation enough. I'm concerned. You have the rise of the original radical Islamic organization. It was the Muslim Brotherhood, started in 1922 by a guy named Hassan al-Banna, and he decided that all Muslims needed to get back to that sort of radical fundamentalist view that Islam is the answer and jihad, holy war, is the way. Mm-hmm. And he was the architect of this. And it started in Egypt, which is really the intellectual and spiritual center of Sunni Islam. And now the Muslim Brotherhood has taken over. It took them 100 years, almost, 90 years. Now they're there. And they plan to attack Israel and wipe out Israel as soon as they can. Now, there are prophecies about Egypt, but the short version is this is a bad idea to be giving weapon systems to the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, now, the president's doing this under the idea that we have a treaty obligation between Israel and Egypt and the United States on the Camp David Accords. Egypt made peace, therefore we give them money and weapons. But this is not the same government. This is a totally different legal entity. That government, that system was overthrown, and now radical jihadists are in charge. It's so short-sighted, and I would say it borders on lunacy to be selling or giving the most advanced weapon systems that we have to people who hate us. This is the bizarro world.
Yeah, so much flies in the face of reason, and we think, did that just happen? What? Yeah, it is just crazy.
Now, there's a complicated relationship. One other point with Mohammed Morsi is the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, the leader of Egypt. It's actually a little nuanced right now, because even though Morsi hates Israel, when Hamas started firing all those rockets at Israel last November, Morsi stepped in and was able to rein Hamas back. Egypt has also intercepted a number of weapon systems coming from Iran to Hamas. So this is what's complicating the situation for the White House. Some of your listeners will be like, the president makes bad decisions every day, and this is just one of them. Okay, that's a reasonable or assessment. But there's the other assessment, which is they don't want to do it, but they're not sure how to handle it. Morsi's playing a semi-constructive role in a way that seems counterintuitive to their stated long-term objectives. And since they're playing a useful role now, you think, well, maybe how do we handle it? Well, you don't give them F-16s. If there's food aid, you can find a way to help this country. These 80 million Egyptians, they're poor, they're badly led. We don't have to cut them off tomorrow necessarily, but you don't give them F-16s. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what the lunacy portion of the program comes in. Yeah.
Well, speaking of food aid and humanitarian efforts, let's talk about the Joshua Fund.
Good, one of my favorite topics.
Yeah.
Hey, I'll tell you what. We have a couple of Joel's books that we were going to give away. Why don't we play a song, talk about the books, and let's give the books away, and we'll come back and talk about the Joshua.
It sounds like a plan, and spoken from the president and CEO. Joel, how do you argue with that?
I think you go with that.
I'm going to go with it. I've got a great song lined up for you now by Selah. It Must Be You. It's Moses' song on 91.5 Kingdom FM's Praise in the Morning. More with Joel C. Rosenberg when we get back. Got 2 books to give away right now. How about callers number 3 and 4, 274-9150, 274-9150. That's area code 239. And if you are caller number 3 or 4, say, hey, I want that book, Damascus Countdown. And here's Selah now. Great dialing music for you. More with Joel Rosenberg when we return right here on 91.5 Kingdom FM's Praise in the Morning. I'm pressing my button. There we go. It works. I have the technology. I just don't know how to use it. We'll be right back. It Must Be You, Moses song by Selah on 91.5 Kingdom FM's Praise in the Morning. Well, hello there. Stephanie Fraschetti in the studio with our president and CEO, Art Ramos. We also have Joel C. Rosenberg in the house with us. New York Times best-selling author, 7 novels, 5 nonfiction books. You've been listening to him this morning. We've had great discussions on biblical prophecy, what's going on in the Middle East and North Korea, and we could go on. We could have our own little geopolitical prophetic conference right here for hours, but the show doesn't go on that long. So we're going to get back to some music in just a bit, but Joel has also established an amazing nonprofit, and we want to find out about that because we are all about the love of Jesus reaching out to the world. Joel, thanks again so much for being with us, and talk to us about the Joshua Fund.
Well, glad to be with you, Stephanie. Just tweeted out the picture we just took here in the studio. Glad to be with you guys. The Joshua Fund is a nonprofit ministry that my wife, Lynn, and I started in the year 2006. And the reason was because here I was going all over the country, all over the world, talking about these novels, about prophecies of bad things that could happen in the Middle East. And we felt that the Lord was saying, there's some bad things happening already in the Middle East.
Right.
Maybe don't just talk about these things, but maybe make a difference. And so the Joshua Fund is designed to mobilize Christians to bless Israel and her neighbors in the name of Jesus. Mm-hmm. We educate by doing conferences, by doing tours. We're doing a tour to Israel this summer. But we're also providing food, clothing, medical supplies, and other humanitarian relief through local believers, Israeli, Jewish believers, Palestinian, Arab believers, as well as in Syria and in Iraq. I've been to Iraq 4 times now. We've done pastors' conferences throughout the region, encouragement of persecuted believers. So the point is to strengthen the local believers in Israel and in the Arab countries so that they can be a witness and to be strong for the gospel and just showing compassion to people who are in need and who are suffering from war and terrorism.
So effective to work with the local believers already on the ground there because they understand the culture, they understand where the need is, they understand the people. Hey, just real quick, I just want to let you know if you're our listeners and you're still calling in, we were able to give the 2 books away, Damascus Countdown, Joel's latest novel, to Mikkel and also Clint. Mikkel and Clint got those books. Congratulations. If you want to get a copy of the book, most certainly you can. 4 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, Amazon, anywhere online really, or even better yet, you can hear Joel Saturday night, tomorrow night, and Sunday morning, 2 services, First Baptist Church Naples. Find out more about that at FBCN, First Baptist Church Naples. See how that works? FBCN.org to find out more about Joel speaking at First Baptist Church Naples this weekend and get your copy of the book there. So Joshua Fund, does it have its own website?
Yes, joshuafund.net. Mm-hmm. Joshuafund.net. You can learn about what we're doing, why we're doing it. And, for those who are interested, if you've never been to Israel before, come with us this summer. We're doing a tour. Now, people say, now, wait a minute. Didn't you say there could be a big war over there this summer?
Isn't it?
Yeah, that's possible.
Scary.
But now you're doing a tour? Yeah, we've got 230 people signed up. We're doing an epicenter conference there. You're going to be able to do humanitarian relief with us, see our warehouse, meet Jewish believers, Palestinian believers. I'll be teaching prophecy, current events. Now, here's the deal. What we tell people is, look, if there's a war or if there's a war imminent and we have to cancel the trip, you get 100% of your money back. Okay. We're not obviously going to take you into a missile zone, but we'll go.
Good to know.
I was in Israel doing a pastors' conference in November, and the war with Gaza broke out, and we were there while sirens were going off, missiles overhead, the Iron Dome shooting down the missiles overhead. It was really a striking time. But we're not asking your listeners to come into that. Yeah. That's what we do.
Right.
That's what God has called us to do. But this is a critical moment. While the world abandons Israel and the Palestinians, followers of Jesus Christ need to show them that God loves them. We need to show it first. Then we need to share the gospel, teach the word of God. But we show it in a practical way.
Right.
And Jesus fed people. He healed people. But he did it with unconditional love. Right, when he fed the 5,000 up in Galilee, Jesus didn't say, listen, if you're going to follow me forever and you want to be born again, get in this line, you'll get your
feed you,
food.
right.
But if you're not planning to follow me, get in this line, you get bupkis. Nothing. No, he fed people regardless of whether they were going to follow him or not. Same thing with the 10 lepers. He heals 10. Only one comes back to bow down and worship him. But he had healed all of them. Why? Because that's his nature.
Yeah.
He provides unconditional love. And that's what the Joshua Fund does. We don't put any strings on the aid that we give. We do it truly, as purely as God allows us to do it, sincerely, to care for people who need help. Do we hope that they want to know the Messiah? Absolutely. I'm Jewish. I'm so glad that people came along and said, hey, Joel, guess what? Jesus is the Messiah. This is how we know this. Yeah. I'm so grateful for that. And, of course, that's our heart.
Yeah, terrific. I would love to hear, I'm sure that you have so many, but one life-changing moment that you've experienced with regards to your work with the Joshua Fund in the Middle East.
Well, gosh, there's been so many. You caught me off guard with that because it might a flood.
I can see it in your eyes. You're like, which one?
Come to mind. Well, one of them is an opportunity that came up. Can I give you like a 2-minute story?
Absolutely.
Okay, maybe it's good. We wrap on a good and high note. I'm going to talk about Syria because right now more than 70,000 people have died in Syria. Some reports say 90,000. There are 1 million refugees. This is a big civil war. The country's melting down. Now, while we focus primarily on Israel, God told us to love people and the neighbors also, so we've been trying to do that over the years. Long story short, a few years ago, we got a call from some Arab Christians in Syria, and they said, listen, we produced a film about the life of the Apostle Paul, but when he was Saul and he came to faith in Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus. What happened was the top Syrian woman newscaster, sort of the Katie Couric of Syria,
Yeah.
she came to faith in Jesus Christ by reading an Arabic version of Josh McDowell's book, More Than a Carpenter.
Wow.
And she became so fascinated that she started reading the Bible. Well, as she read the Bible, she thought, oh my goodness, Syria is mentioned all the time. Damascus is mentioned all the time. It was a hugely influential place in the New Testament. So she thought, I need to do a story on this. But she thought, well, this is a 2,000-year-old news story. It doesn't really qualify as breaking news, right? It was breaking news to her. So she wrote a script for a film that would sort of dramatize the events of the life of Saul coming to faith on the road to Damascus, and then it was like a docudrama. There'd be dramatized scenes, then it would cut away to her actually at the locations where these things happened and reporting. So it was a mixture.
Sure.
Well, she makes this film, and then she thinks, oh, wait a minute. I can't show this film. We're in Syria.
Hello.
You need permission of Bashar al-Assad, the president. So she is a reporter, so she sends an advance copy of the DVD to the palace and says, is there any chance the president could watch this and give his approval for us to show it? Then they decided not to name the film The Rabbi Who Comes to Jesus in Syria.
Right.
Right? I mean, the Jew who becomes the believer in Jesus. No, they just call it Damascus. Well, a few weeks later, she gets a call from a senior advisor to President Assad and says, the president has watched the film, was very deeply impressed that you portray the importance of Syria, and particularly our capital, Damascus, in the history of Christendom. We think this is an excellent representation of the important role of Damascus in the world's history. So yes, the president approves this being shown, but he would like it to be premiered in his own personal movie theater. Now, imagine that.
Wow.
So she's encouraged on the one hand, but then she's a little flummoxed, and she says, well, that's very kind. We don't have the funds. We have no operation here to put on a big gala premiere, right? He said, the advisor said, let me think about that. I will get back to you. Give me a few days. Calls back in a few days and says, the president says, don't worry about it. He will cover all the expenses. The Minister of Culture will be in charge of the event.
Ryan Seacrest is on his way.
Well,
not quite.
and you just give us a list of all the Christian leaders in the country that you want to attend. We'll put together a list of all the Muslim leaders and the cabinet officials and members of parliament that will attend. And so in March of 2009, they held this premiere. And I think it's about 1,700 people showed to watch this film about a Jewish rabbi coming to faith in Jesus on the road to Damascus. And the film's subtitle, it was called Damascus,
Sure.
but the subtitle or the catchphrase for the posters was, he came as a terrorist, he left as an apostle. So then once the president's, now he didn't attend, but he'd already seen it.
Yeah.
But once this premiere happened, everybody in the country wanted to see it. So they held premieres in all the cities. Then we got a call saying, Joel, would the Joshua Fund help us produce DVDs that we can make available to people all throughout Syria? Well, for me, knowing the prophecies that judgment is coming to Syria generally and Damascus in particular at some point,
Sure.
and knowing our heart to love the neighbors of Israel,
And evangelize.
we thought, wow, well, we would have never imagined a scenario we could help fund a film that could do this. So we, over the course of a period of time, we were able to raise about, I think, $430,000 for 430,000 copies of this Damascus film, which has now spread not just in Syria, but in Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, and among the Palestinians. Sharing the gospel, it's just exciting that God opens doors. Now, if that woman had wanted to make that film today, it couldn't be done.
Mm-mm.
If we'd wanted to help now, we couldn't do it because Syria is imploding. But think of all the people that heard the gospel message because a few Arab believers had a vision to do something like that when there was time, and we in the West, Christians, through the Joshua Fund, were able to help our brothers and sisters do the work God had called them to at a time where what they needed was resources. They had courage, they had vision, they needed help, and we were able to help them.
And, you know, had we taken a Western film crew over there and tried to produce a film of this magnitude or of this subject matter, it would have never been as effective because we didn't have the cultural insight.
That's right.
And so it was produced so authentically and with such integrity, and by virtue of that was able to really, really pierce the hearts of so many people.
Amen. So those are the type of projects that God is opening. Some things are much quieter and smaller than that. Giving food out on a daily basis or a monthly basis to families in need is not, exciting. There's not big stories to tell about that, and we try to protect the privacy of each of the families we're giving to. But we were able to help start a Christian radio station in Iraq. First ever legal Christian radio station in Iraq, and they set it up. We helped fund it, and then the head of the station said, we can't get the final license signed. We have all the other paperwork signed, but to go on the air, we need the signature of the Prime Minister. Would you come over, Joel, and ask the Prime Minister for a signature? I said, all right, I may have a bad connection, but I thought you were asking an American Jewish follower of Jesus who worked for the Israeli Prime Minister to come ask the Kurdish Prime Minister in northern Iraq for permission who's Muslim, to reach Muslims with the gospel of Jesus through a radio station.
Is that what you just said?
Am I getting that? He's like, yeah. I said, are you kidding me? He said, no. So I went. The Lord opened the door. I sat with the Prime Minister. He gave the signature. You know, God is working in amazing ways, some through film, some through radio, some through food and pastors' conferences. God is doing a great thing
fiction
in the Middle East.
novels.
Through novels, yeah. One of my novels, Ezekiel Option, is translated into Hebrew and Russian, and there's like 10,000 copies moving through Israel at this moment.
Terrific. Well, God bless you. Obviously, He has, and we're just really excited about what He's going to continue to do through you, Joel. Joel Rosenberg, Joel C. Rosenberg in the studio with us today. It has been a blast. I've enjoyed our time together so much, and you're welcome in this studio anytime.
Well, usually when we talk about Middle East things, I don't like to say blast, but okay.
Yeah, right.
I know the spirit that you mentioned.
It's been a whole lot of fun. It's been a whole lot of fun. Hey, we've got more music on the way for you in just minutes, but to hear more from Joel, check out First Baptist Church Naples. He is the speaker this weekend at the services, Saturday evening at 6, Sunday morning at 9:30, and then once again at 11. And you can hear more. You can get a copy of Damascus Countdown. And for more, check out Joel online, joelrosenberg.com, and also joshuafund.net. I've got some Sanctus Real for you now. The Redeemer on 91.5 Kingdom FM's Praise in the Morning on the way.